Have you ever been left by someone only to watch them come back like nothing happened? No apology, no explanation, just back. If you've loved deeply, especially as an empath, you know this cycle all too well. They pull away when you get close, disappear when you care the most, and somehow, they return when you finally start healing. This isn't coincidence. This is a pattern. And today, I'm going to show you why avoidants always come back to the very people they once rejected, and what that says about your power. Empaths have a way of offering something that feels rare in today's world: genuine emotional safety. When an avoidant person encounters that kind of energy, it doesn't just pass by unnoticed. It hits them on a deeper level, even if they don't fully understand it themselves. An empath listens without rushing to judge, understands without needing everything explained, and gives without constantly keeping score. For someone who has spent most of their life guarding their emotions, this kind of presence can feel both comforting and unfamiliar at the same time. Avoidants are often used to relationships that stay on the surface. They know how to keep things light, controlled, and emotionally distant. But an empath changes that dynamic without even trying. They create a space where emotions naturally rise to the surface. They ask meaningful questions. They notice the small changes in mood. They care in a way that feels consistent and real. And for an avoidant, this can be the first time they feel truly seen, not for what they show the world, but for who they are underneath. That feeling of being seen is powerful. It touches a part of them they usually keep hidden. Even if they don't express it, they begin to feel a sense of comfort around the empath. They may open up in small ways, share things they don't normally share, or simply feel more at ease being themselves. This is the connection they secretly crave, even if they've spent years convincing themselves they don't need it. But here's where the conflict begins. The same emotional depth that draws them in also starts to trigger fear. When someone gets too close, it challenges the walls they've built for protection. Vulnerability feels risky. Dependence feels dangerous. And so instead of leaning into the connection, they begin to pull away. Not because the empath did anything wrong, but because the connection is real enough to scare them. Even when they leave, that experience doesn't just disappear. The emotional safety, the understanding, the warmth that stays with them. They may try to move on, meet new people, distract themselves, but something feels different. Other connections may feel easier, but they also feel less meaningful. The empath set a standard that's hard to replace. It's not about perfection, it's about authenticity. And once someone has experienced that level of genuine care, it becomes difficult to go back to something shallow. Over time, this creates a quiet realization inside the avoidant. They begin to recognize that what they had was not ordinary. It wasn't something they can easily find again. The empath didn't just offer attention, they offered presence, patience, and emotional depth without forcing it. That kind of connection lingers in memory, not because it was intense or dramatic, but because it felt real. So even if they walked away, a part of them remains connected to that feeling. They may not admit it openly. They may not even fully understand it. But they remember how it felt to be accepted without pressure, understood without explanation, and valued without conditions. That's what draws them back, not just the person, but the emotional experience they couldn't find anywhere else. And this is where the empath's true value becomes clear. It's not in chasing, convincing, or proving anything. It's in simply being who they are, because what they offer naturally is something many people are searching for, even those who are afraid of it. The connection they create is not easily replaced, and that's why it continues to live in the hearts of those who once walked away from it. Avoidants don't usually walk away when things are casual, easy, and surface level. In fact, that's where they feel the most comfortable. Everything is controlled, emotions are limited, and there's no real pressure to be vulnerable. But the moment a connection starts to deepen, when feelings become real, when consistency builds, when emotional closeness begins to form, that's when something inside them shifts. What looks like a growing bond to you can start to feel like a loss of control to them. At first, they may enjoy the connection. They may show up more, communicate better, and even give glimpses of vulnerability. It can feel like things are finally progressing, like trust is building and something meaningful is forming. But underneath that progress, there's often a quiet tension growing. The closer they get, the more they start to feel exposed. And for someone who has learned to protect themselves by staying emotionally distant, that exposure can feel overwhelming. It's not always a conscious decision. They don't sit down and think, "This is getting too real, I should leave." Instead, their behavior starts to change subtly at first. They may take longer to respond, seem less engaged, or create small amounts of distance. They might become inconsistent, hot and cold, or suddenly busy when they were once available. These shifts are often signs that the emotional intensity is starting to trigger their internal defenses. As the connection deepens further, so does their discomfort. Real intimacy requires openness, honesty, and emotional risk, things avoidants struggle with at their core. They may begin to feel pressure, even if none is being placed on them. Simple expectations like communication, consistency, or emotional presence can start to feel like demands. And instead of expressing that fear or asking for space in a healthy way, they tend to withdraw to the other person, especially an empath. This can feel confusing and painful. One moment everything feels aligned, and the next, it's like the connection is slipping away for no clear reason. You may question yourself, wondering if you did something wrong, if you were too much, or if you pushed too hard. But the truth is, it's rarely about anything you did. It's about what the connection represents to them. When emotions become real, it forces avoidants to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding: fear of rejection, fear of dependence, fear of losing themselves in someone else. These fears don't always make logical sense, but they feel real enough to trigger a retreat. Distance becomes their way of regaining control, of calming the internal discomfort that closeness creates. Sometimes they may justify their withdrawal with reasons that sound practical: needing space, focusing on themselves, not being ready for a relationship. And while those reasons can hold some truth, they often mask a deeper fear of intimacy. Walking away feels easier than staying and facing those emotions head on. What makes this pattern so difficult is that it often happens right when things start to feel meaningful. Just as trust is forming and connection is deepening, they pull away. It creates a cycle where closeness leads to distance, and distance leaves the other person searching for answers. But understanding this pattern helps bring clarity. It shows that their withdrawal is not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of their own internal struggle with intimacy. The reality is, avoidants don't leave because the connection isn't real. In many cases, they leave because it is. And for them, real connection can feel like the very thing they don't know how to handle. When avoidants create distance, they often believe that choosing relief. In the moment, stepping away feels like regaining control, like finally being able to breathe again, without the pressure of emotional expectations. The closeness that once felt comforting starts to feel overwhelming, so distance becomes their solution. They tell themselves they need space, that things were moving too fast, or that they just need time to focus on themselves. And at first, that space does exactly what they hoped: it quiets the intensity. Without constant emotional engagement, they feel calmer. There are no deep conversations to navigate, no expectations to meet, no vulnerability required. Life becomes simpler again, at least on the surface. But what they don't expect is what comes after that initial sense of relief. Because once the noise fades, something else begins to take its place: awareness. Distance has a way of creating clarity that closeness sometimes hides. When they were in the connection, their focus was on managing their discomfort, trying to keep control, and avoiding emotional exposure. But once they step away, they're no longer reacting in the moment. They start observing from a distance. And in that space, they begin to notice what's missing. It's not always immediate. At first, they may distract themselves spending time with friends, focusing on work, or even exploring new connections. But those distractions don't fully replace what they had. Slowly, in quiet moments, memories start to surface. Not just the intense or emotional ones, but the small, consistent things the way you understood them, without needing long explanations. The sense of ease in your presence, the feeling of being accepted without pressure. They begin to compare without even trying. Other interactions may feel easier, less demanding, but they also feel less meaningful. Conversations don't go as deep. The connection doesn't feel as genuine. And that's when the realization starts to form. What they walked away from wasn't ordinary. It had depth, and that depth is hard to replicate. Distance also removes the illusion that they were better off without the connection. In the absence of your presence, your energy becomes more noticeable. The support, the care, the emotional consistency are no longer there to provide it. And that absence creates a kind of emotional gap. Even if they can't fully articulate it, they feel the difference. This is where clarity begins to settle in. They start to see the connection from a new perspective, one that isn't clouded by fear or overwhelm. They may recognize that you didn't demand too much, that the connection wasn't suffocating, and that the closeness they ran from was actually something meaningful. But by the time they reach this understanding, they're already on the outside of the relationship, looking back. For avoidance, this delayed clarity is part of the pattern. They often understand the value of something only after they've created distance from it. It's not because they didn't feel it before, it's because they couldn't process it while they were in it. The emotional intensity made it hard to think clearly, so they escaped first and reflected later. And this reflection doesn't always come with immediate action. Sometimes it lingers quietly. Sometimes it grows stronger over time. But once that clarity sets in, it's difficult to ignore. They begin to realize that what they left behind wasn't just a person, it was a connection that offered something real, something rare. That's why distance doesn't always create detachment for avoidance. In many cases, it does the opposite. It removes the fear long enough for them to see the truth. And in that truth, they start to understand what they lost, what they felt, and why it still matters more than they expected. When an avoidant connects with an empath, they experience a level of emotional depth that quietly sets a new standard in their mind. It's not something they consciously decide, and it's not always something they admit, but it happens naturally. The way an empath listens, understands, and responds creates a kind of connection that feels different from what they used to. It's not forced, it's not superficial, and it doesn't rely on constant validation or control. It simply feels real. At the time, they may not fully appreciate it. In fact, they might even downplay it or convince themselves it's not that significant. But the experience stays with them. The emotional presence, the patience, the ability to hold space without judgment, these things leave an impression. And once they've felt that kind of connection, it becomes something they subconsciously compare everything else to. After they walk away, they often try to return to what feels safe and familiar. They may engage in lighter, less demanding connections, where there's no pressure to open up or be vulnerable. On the surface, this feels easier. There are fewer expectations, fewer emotional risks, and more control, but something is missing. The depth isn't there. The understanding doesn't feel as natural. The connection doesn't reach the same level. This is where the comparison begins. Even if they don't actively try to make it, it shows up in small ways. Conversations that feel repetitive or surface level. Moments where they realize they can't be fully themselves. Interactions that lack the emotional warmth they once experienced. And slowly, they start to recognize that what they had before was different. It's important to understand that this isn't about perfection. Empaths aren't perfect, and the connection wasn't flawless. But it was authentic. It had a sense of emotional honesty that's hard to replicate. The empath didn't just engage on the surface, they connected on a deeper level, and that level of connection becomes the benchmark. Avoidants might resist this realization at first. They may try to convince themselves that they don't need that kind of depth, that simpler connections are better for them. But the feeling doesn't go away. Once you've experienced being understood without having to explain every part of yourself, it's hard to settle for being misunderstood or only partially seen. This creates a kind of internal conflict. On one hand, they still have their instinct to avoid emotional intensity and maintain independence. On the other hand, they've now experienced something that goes beyond surface-level interaction. They've felt what it's like to be emotionally connected in a way that feels safe and genuine. And even if that experience once scared them, it also left a mark. Over time, this standard becomes more noticeable. They may go through multiple interactions or even relationships, but something continues to feel incomplete. It's not always something they can clearly explain to others, but internally, they know the difference. They've already experienced a connection that felt more aligned, more natural, and more emotionally fulfilling. And this is where the empath's impact becomes undeniable. Without trying to prove anything or compete with anyone, They've already shown what real connection feels like. They didn't force it. They didn't demand it. They simply offered it through their presence and authenticity. That experience becomes something the avoidant carries with them, whether they acknowledge it or not. So even after they leave, the standard remains. It's not about chasing or replacing, it's about remembering. Remembering how it felt to be accepted, to be understood, and to be connected in a way that didn't feel forced. And once that standard is set, it quietly influences how they see every connection that comes after. When avoidants return after a period of distance, it can often feel sudden or even confusing to the other person. From the outside, it may look like they've simply changed their mind or realized what they lost. But in reality, their return is usually less about emotional readiness and more about internal regulation, meaning they come back when their nervous system feels calmer, when life feels less overwhelming, or when emotional avoidance no longer feels necessary. In the moment. During their time away, avoidants typically go through a cycle. First comes relief from distance, then comes reflection, comparison, and sometimes even longing. But what often pushes them back isn't just missing the person, it's a combination of emotional emptiness, loneliness, or a desire for familiar comfort. When life becomes emotionally quiet or less stimulating elsewhere, the memory of the empath resurfaces with more intensity. However, this return is not always rooted in deep emotional transformation. Many times, the core fear of intimacy hasn't fully changed. What has changed is the emotional environment they are in at that moment. If they feel stable, safe, or less pressured, they may feel more capable of reconnecting. But if stress, responsibility, or emotional demands rise again, the same avoidant patterns can reappear. This is why their return can sometimes feel inconsistent. They may come back with warmth, nostalgia, or even regret, expressing that they miss you or that they think about you often. In those moments, it can feel like clarity has finally arrived. But without deeper inner work, those feelings can fluctuate. The same fears that caused them to withdraw initially can resurface once closeness begins to rebuild. It's important to understand that avoidants are often driven by emotional states, rather than stable emotional decisions. When they are alone or disconnected, they may feel the absence strongly. The empath's presence, support, and emotional understanding begin to feel irreplaceable again. But when closeness is restored too quickly, their system can shift back into protection mode, creating a cycle of approach and withdrawal. This is why their return should not always be interpreted as a full resolution of the past. Sometimes, it is an attempt to reconnect with something that felt meaningful, without yet having the tools to sustain it in a healthy way. They may genuinely care, they may genuinely miss the connection, but care alone is not always enough to override deeply ingrained patterns of emotional avoidance. From the empath's perspective, this can be emotionally complex. The return can reopen feelings, memories, and hope. It can feel like a second chance or a validation of the connection's depth, but without consistency and emotional growth on both sides, the same dynamic can repeat itself: closeness followed by discomfort, then distance again. That is why the timing of their return matters. They often come back when they feel emotionally safe enough to re-engage, not necessarily when they are fully ready to sustain long-term intimacy. Safety in their internal world is the key trigger. If they feel grounded and not emotionally overwhelmed, they can reach out. If that safety is disrupted, withdrawal can return just as quickly. Ultimately, their return reflects a combination of emotional memory and present moment comfort, rather than a complete transformation of attachment patterns. It shows that the connection left an impact, but it does not always guarantee permanence. Real change requires awareness, consistency, and the willingness to face discomfort rather than escape it. So when they come back, it is less about rewriting the entire story and more about revisiting a chapter that still holds emotional weight for them. Whether that chapter continues or repeats depends not only on their return, but on whether anything inside them has truly changed. At the core of every avoidant empath dynamic, the most important turning point is not when they leave or when they return, but when the empath finally stops chasing. Because the truth is, this cycle often continues not just because of the avoidance behavior, but because the dynamic itself is sustained by emotional pursuit, hope, and unfinished attachment. When the empath keeps reaching out, explaining, waiting, or trying to fix things, it unconsciously reinforces the cycle. It keeps the emotional door open, even when the avoidant has already stepped out of it. But when the empath stops chasing, something shifts. Not in a dramatic or reactive way, but in a quiet, grounded decision to choose themselves. This is where real emotional power begins to show, not in proving love, not in convincing someone to stay, but in withdrawing energy from a connection that is no longer mutual. For an empath, this is often the hardest step because their nature is to understand, to give, and to hold space for others. They often see potential, memories, and emotional depth, and they struggle to let go of what once felt meaningful. However, continuing to chase an avoidant partner rarely creates security. In most cases, it increases distance. The more pressure an avoidant feels emotionally, mentally, or even through repeated attempts at connection, the more their instinct is to withdraw. Not because they don't care at all, but because closeness under pressure triggers their internal defense system. This creates a painful loop. The empath reaches, the avoidant retreats, the empath reaches harder, and the avoidant withdraws further. Breaking that cycle requires a shift in focus. Instead of trying to pull someone closer, the empath begins to redirect that energy inward. That doesn't mean shutting down emotions or pretending the connection never mattered. It means acknowledging the feelings fully, but no longer letting those feelings control actions, decisions, or self-worth. There is a difference between feeling love and acting from attachment anxiety. One is natural, the other becomes exhausting when it is not reciprocated. When an empath chooses themselves, the entire emotional structure of the relationship changes. The absence of chasing creates space, and in that space, clarity emerges. The empath starts to see the situation more realistically, not just through emotional highs and lows, but through patterns. They begin to recognize consistency, effort, and emotional availability as true markers of connection than potential or temporary moments of closeness. This is also where self-respect becomes stronger. Boundaries start to form naturally. Instead of asking, "Why aren't they choosing me?" the question slowly shifts to, "Why am I choosing someone who repeatedly steps away from me?" That shift is powerful because it returns control to the individual. It breaks the illusion that love must be proven through endurance, waiting, or suffering. For the avoidant, this change is also significant. When the empath stops chasing, the dynamic they were used to changes completely. The emotional safety net they might have relied on, whether consciously or unconsciously, is no longer available in the same way. There is no longer constant reassurance, no repeated emotional pursuit, no guaranteed access to the same level of care. This often creates a moment of realization where the absence becomes more noticeable than the presence ever was. But the deeper meaning of not chasing is not about triggering the avoidant to return. It is about breaking dependency. It is about ending a cycle where one person's emotional availability is inconsistent, while the other person continues to overextend themselves trying to maintain connection. True healing begins when emotional effort is no longer one-sided. In that space of distance and silence, the empath begins to rebuild their own emotional foundation. They reconnect with themselves, their needs, and their boundaries. They learn that love without consistency is not stability, and that connection without reciprocity eventually leads to exhaustion. And slowly, what once felt like longing begins to transform into clarity. The real power then is not in waiting for someone to come back differently, but in no longer needing them to. Because when the empath stops chasing, they don't lose the connection, they regain themselves.